Yeah, I appreciate your patience tonight. It's been a moment since I've done some public speaking. I find out.
All right, we're doing the Big Ten Conference. This conference is definitely having a down year. In a conference this is a conference that usually has a good amount of teams from it, a lot of good teams. You know, you're like sitting there like, man, who's the best team in this conference? You know, or you kind of usually know who the best team is, who the top couple teams are, but there's usually about like 6 or 7 teams right there in the middle that are really good that you just don't know which ones are the better ones and which ones are going to, you know, fold in conference play. But this year is a lot different. You know, your middle of the road teams honestly look really bad. They don't really look that good. And then, you know, the teams that are good are really pretty good, and they can potentially go pretty far in the tournament. But I don't think this conference is gonna have a lot of teams coming out for the tournament this year. But Michigan State is one of them. Michigan State's very good this year, returning a lot of those sophomores. Well, a lot of those freshmen from last year, which are sophomores now. Miles Bridges is the big guy that they have, that they're the big one that they're bringing back. And then, you know, to go with them, Nick Ward, Cassius Winston, other good guys. And then Joshua Langford is another one of those sophomores from last year. They had a really good freshman class come in. Some other guys on the team, Matt McQuaid, who's a junior, Duncanville, Texas. Leroy Nollins, a guard who's all right. He's a senior, kind of a senior leader. And then the big guy that they got this year was Jaren Jackson, and he's been pretty good for them. He's the freshman that probably plays the most out of the freshmen that they have. This is a very good team, definitely a top. This could definitely be a Final Four team this year. In the world of college football, where there's lots of freshmen, for you to have this many sophomores on your team that came back that could have gone to the draft. It looks very well. And then Tom Izzo always, regardless of the team that he has, he usually has teams that are worse than this team, and they usually go pretty far in the tournament. So I like what Michigan State has this year. Definitely in a weak conference, they're going to look really good. They're going to be projected to go really deep. So let's see what happens with them. Minnesota's another one of those teams that's returning a ton of their players. You know, if you didn't watch this team any last year and you just kind of watched their tournament game, you would have said, man, this team was all right. And they drew Middle Tennessee in the tournament. Very tough game that they lost. Middle Tennessee was shooting the ball really well. But Minnesota's brought back a lot of their guys. They didn't really lose a lot of guys. When you talk about their defense, Reggie Lynch, big guy down low that's really good. Defensively, you know, he kind of lacks offensive skill set, but he's very good on the defensive end of the floor. And then a guy that's really came on this year, who was an all right player last year, but has really figured it out this last year, is Jordan Murphy, double machine, a really good player. And then to finish out the team, Nate Mason is their senior point guard who makes the machine run. Very good player. Amir Coffey, another good one. Amir Coffey is probably the guy that has the most NBA potential on this team. He's a 6'8" guard who's really good, who's a sophomore this year. I like him a lot. A guy that's came on this year is Isaiah Washington, kind of filled Akeem Springs' spot. And he's a really good freshman. I don't know how they got him, but he's a really good player. And Dupree McBuyer is another guy that is on the team. Who's one of those like core wings that plays a lot. Eric Curry, another one of them. This team's really good, but you know they could have a slip up and they could have one bad game, and that could ruin them in the tournament. They're a team that probably most nights they're gonna bring their best, but there's some certain nights where they just don't look very good at all. And hopefully, you know, Minnesota can avoid those, you know, down the stretch. Next team, I'm going to talk about Purdue. Purdue's very good. You know, Purdue's really scary. If Purdue gets matched up against a team that doesn't have very many big men or just not a lot of big men, they've got 2 7-3 guys, 7-2 and 7-3, and they're kind of waste of space, honestly. Isaac Haas is a senior this year. He really only averages a little bit over 5 rebounds or so. He really doesn't do what his size should allow him to do. But he does good. He's a good player. He's someone that you have to prepare for. Matt Harms is a freshman from Netherlands. He redshirted last year. He's very tall. He plays with a lot of energy. He'll make some key plays this year for Purdue. If he can stay out of foul trouble, he honestly is probably a better player than Isaac Haas. Probably fits this team better. He's more active on the defensive end also. And to talk about the core of this team, P.J. Taylor, a guard, and Carson Edwards, another guard. That's their starting guards. Carson Edwards, just a sophomore. He had a pretty good freshman season last year. He was hot at times. I look at him as the guy that's really going to have to make this go this year. And then you talk about some of the shooters, Ryan Klein, Dakota Mathias. Dakota Mathias is a pretty good defender. He's a pretty underrated player. He doesn't really look that athletic, but he's a pretty good shooter. And he's a key part of this team. And then Vince Edwards is just kind of the X factor. Depending on how Vince Edwards plays, is kind of how depends on if the Boilermakers win that night or not. He's a real key part of the team. Going forward, I'm going Michigan. At this point, it gets to these teams just aren't as good as those top three teams. Who has the best coach with the team around them, and that's going to be John Beilein. John Beilein is an awesome coach. He doesn't really get a lot of the credit that he deserves. He really doesn't have that great of teams all the time, and they usually go pretty far. When you think back at the team when you had Trey Burke and Hardaway, that team was pretty good, Mitch McGary. But lately they hadn't been as good, and they make the tournament just about every year. They somehow make it in. The leader on the team, Moritz Wagner, he talked about going to the draft last year. He had a really good tournament. He's got very good feet work on the offensive end. He needs to work on his defense. That's a good reason that he came back. But he's the best player on this team, a key player. Muhammad Ali Abdul Rahman, a good guard. He's a senior this year. Duncan Robinson, a senior, really good three-point shooter for them. And they have some good transfers and freshmen. When we talk about Charles Matthews, he transferred in over from Kentucky. He's a good guard on the wing. That's been good for them. Eli Booker is kind of made his way into the starting lineup. And he's a freshman guard who's pretty good. But this team's not necessarily deep, but it has a good couple of good it has a good amount of good players on it, and I think that they can make the tournament. Next team is Maryland. It's kind of the same thing. Maryland, I think that they're going to play better than these other teams this year and get in. And when you talk about Maryland, they are returning a good amount of their players from last year. They had three freshmen, Anthony Cohen, Kevin Herter, and Justin Jackson, all three returning, all three very good players. Kevin Herter can shoot the ball pretty well. Justin Jackson can get in the paint. He can rebound pretty well, also step out and shoot. And then Anthony Cohen's a good point guard. They have some big guys on the inside, and Ivan Bender. Ivan Bender's out for the year, though. Michael Koveski. And then they also have Bruno Fernando, who's came in. He's from Angola. He's a freshman who's been pretty good. Dion Wiley has been good at times this year. He's got to play some. Jared Nichols has played a little bit. He's a senior. And then Daryl Morsel, who's a freshman, has got to play some too. I've seen him play some. But this isn't a bad team. We'll see where Maryland ends up at the end of the year, but I think they're better than a couple of these other teams in the conference, and I think they could make the tournament. Northwestern has definitely underachieved to start the year. They would probably be a little bit higher in my rankings here, higher in the tiers if they would have showed a little bit more in the preseason. They really didn't win a whole lot of good games, and then games where you wanted them to come in and play and look respectable. At least like against Oklahoma, they lost by like 30 or so. This team just doesn't have that much firepower. It didn't really lose a lot. This team is kind of it was so focused on making an NCAA tournament, and it's like they did that, and like the focus is gone now or something. I don't know what it is, but a good core of players. When you talk about Brian McIntosh, really good point guard, leading assist guy for Northwestern. Scotty Lindsey, a good shooter from the outside. Vic Law, good defensive player. He can dunk. He can play good defense. They kind of lack inside size on the inside. Derek Pardon 6'8", Gavin Skelly 6'8", but those are kind of some of their inside guys. Isaiah Brown, a sophomore this year, he's got to play some. I've seen And then Barrett Benson, another tall guy that I've seen play some. But Northwestern is struggling, and if Northwestern doesn't play good in the Big Ten, I don't think they're going to make the tournament. And that's just how I feel. Ohio State, has brought in Chris Holtmann from Butler as their coach. And this team, they're not really expected to do a whole lot this year. But in the preseason, they've honestly looked pretty good. When you talk about some of their good players, Jayshawn Tate is their best player, their senior. Keada Bates-Diop has been pretty good too. He's a junior. Micah Potter, who played some last year, seen a little bit of him. Cam Williams, who's a senior, is a pretty good player too. And then Andrew Dickow, who transferred in over from Michigan, has made a pretty good impact for them. Penn State, Penn State's another one of those teams that, they're coming up. They've got a lot of sophomores, had a lot of freshmen last year, and they're one of those that they're right here in the middle. We'll see what happens with them. Can they make it to Tier 2 where they fall back to Tier 3? And some of their good players, Tony Carr, their point guard, who's a sophomore out of Philadelphia. And then they have Mike Watkins, a good defensive guy who's a sophomore. He's 6'9", pretty lanky, good player. Lamar Stevens, he's 6'7", another one of those guys from Pennsylvania, one of those sophomores from Pennsylvania. Chef Garner, who's a senior, another good player for them. So this is, they didn't really bring in a whole lot of players this year, or players that I've seen play. But this is a good team. The core players that they brought in from last year did lose Peyton Banks. That was tough. But we'll see what happens out of Penn State. It's too early to say, will they be Tier 2? Will they be Tier 3? We'll see what happens in the next coming weeks. So Wisconsin, Wisconsin is usually a team that's pretty high in the standings, definitely lately. And they're definitely a team, preseason-wise, you probably were thinking, yeah, they'll probably be a tournament team. Ethan Happ, they'll reload just like they reload every year. Well, Happ is the lone senior on the team, and, there's a good amount – well, Happ is actually a junior. There's only one senior on the team is what I meant to say. And then, Khalil Iverson is back. Dimitri Trice was a freshman last year that played some, but he's a sophomore this year, and he struggled a little bit. Brevin Prizzle is a sophomore. He's got to play some. And you talk about some of the young guys that came in. Brad Davison, he's been injured with a shoulder injury a little bit. Kobe King's played some. Both those guys have came on and played good for this Wisconsin team. It's just this Wisconsin team just isn't talented, just very young. They lost 4 starters last year. Tough year for Wisconsin. I don't think Wisconsin makes the tournament this year, but I think they're better than the back half of the Big Ten, even in a bad year. So next, we're going to go Indiana. Indiana really started the year bad, and they've definitely been playing better as of lately. Josh Newkirk and Robert Johnson, the guards on this team, they really lead it. Very good players. Colin Hartman just came back, and he's a good player. He didn't play any last year. He's a senior this year. Deron Davis, is another one. And then Juwan Morgan has really been their most improved player this year. He's played really good and kept them in a couple of games or got them in games. Indiana doesn't look like they're going to be a tournament team this year. They're looking like an NIT. Archie Miller is going to have this team better in the next coming years. Some good freshmen, though, also. I'd say Al Durham has been good. In the time that he's got to play. Now, Illinois is a team that, Brad Underwood, I kind of was keeping them more of they could be a surprise team and be better, but they just don't have enough talent. Their best player is LeRon Black. Michael Fink is another good player, forward that can step out and shoot threes. He's good at rebounding. And then, Dejon Lucas has been good at times. Aaron Jordan has had some big games for them, but they just don't really have like any good. They don't have that core 5 yet. They don't have like the Brad Underwood hadn't figured out who his guys are yet. Trent Frazier is a freshman that's been playing pretty good, and then Mark Alstork is a transfer from Wright State that has played a good amount this year. Iowa's a team that. at the first year we didn't know if they could be a tournament team or what they would be, and I don't think they're a tournament team. They're just really young. One senior on the team, and Jordan Bohannon and Tyler Cook are getting better. They're sophomores this year. If they come back, this is probably be a pretty good team next year. You talk about Isaiah Moss, another player that's pretty good, but this team just kind of lacks the depth. They have Nicholas Baer too, a guy that can step out and shoot threes. They just lack depth, and it just looks like it's going to be a tough year and a tough conference with a lot of teams that are similar to them. But I will say they have been playing better as of lately, and they could pick it up. And like I said, there's a lot of bad teams in the middle of this pack that they could potentially beat. Now, next team is going to be Nebraska. Nebraska's look good at times. It's hard to go into Nebraska and win, I've seen as of lately, but they are losing a lot of guys from last year. Glenn Watson is probably their best player, and then they have other guys that help out, like Isaiah Roby, who's a sophomore. He's played he's been good at times, but a lot of transfers that came in. James Palmer from Miami, Isaac Copeland from Georgetown. Those guys have played a lot, have been good. This team just doesn't have a lot of depth compared to some of the other teams in this conference. And then the last team, Rutgers. Rutgers had a huge win against Seton Hall. Really fun game a couple weeks ago. Corey Sanders played really well in that one, got them the win. Corey Sanders is their best player. Mike Williams is another pretty good player. Deshaun Freeman, but this team doesn't have a lot of good players on it. They've lost to a couple of small conference teams in the last couple of weeks. Doesn't look good going into Big Ten play for Rutgers. I think Rutgers gets last. That's an easy prediction there. But yeah, so like I said, Big Ten is definitely at a point where this conference is not as strong as it was. Hopefully a couple of these teams beat up on the conference and conference play and gets them a couple of players or a couple of teams in here. But to me, it's looking like maybe 5 to 6 teams getting in right now, just with how weak the conference is and how they played in the preseason. Now, player of the year, I'm going Miles Bridges for this conference. Best defensive player, you're going to have to go Reggie Lynch, just his ability to block shots. He's a very good shot blocker. And then most underrated player, I'm going to have to go Nate Mason. I really like Nate Mason. To me, he doesn't get the love that he deserves, so I'm going to go with him as my most underrated player. And then newcomer of the year is probably going to be Jaren Jackson, or Isaiah Washington, one of them. Probably